Now that you learn how to create and render templates, let's learn about template literals in JavaScript and how markup handles things. I still have the code from our previous video ready to go here. So just because it is template literal, it does not mean that everything will be parsed as placed in the template. Markup wants you to write proper HTML. So anything that would not be possible to do in HTML syntax-wise is also not possible in markup. What do I mean? For starters, I can have a greeting variable, for example, with our hello world tags, and then inject it to our template using template literals interpolation syntax. And this is handled just fine if we inspect it in the browser. But I cannot have and inject things anywhere in the tag. For example, if I had a tag variable and use it to define the tag name using the same injection technique, what this results in is a bunch of string placed together in the template, which ends up not being parsed at all. And you can see that markup treated everything as string and did not parse it to a DOM element. The same goes if I wanted to render attributes from a variable. Let me undo this tag nonsense. And have an attribute variable with, for example, type equals button and place it in the body of the opening tag. If I inspect it, you can see that markup simply ignores it and nothing is rendered. Like I said, markup wants you to write proper HTML, no magic and cheating. So render the attribute tags like you would in HTML. The only places you are allowed to inject values are anywhere inside or around a tag, as well as attribute value. We can see that everything here works fine. By the way, if you have a single value injected for the attribute value, you can optionally omit the quotes. But if you want to stay consistent, always add the quotes for the proper HTML look and feel. Now let's talk about injecting values in the template. By default, markup will render everything as string and track the real value behind the scenes. For example, our greeting here is a string and will render a string. But if I inject a number or a boolean, the same happens. They are just rendered a string. Even special objects like set and map will render a string, as they would in JavaScript. Even undefined and null will render a string, which means you need to be careful with what you try to render. If you don't want to render anything, provide an empty string. However, markup handles a lot of type of objects in a special way. One of them is the array. If I try to render an array of numbers, you will see it renders it as 3 separate string nodes. This is because markup is already optimized to render the lists, meaning if you have a list and render it, and then change a single item in that list, markup will only update the place in the DOM corresponding to that index in the array. Another thing markup handles in a special way is functions. If I have a function that returns a value, the template will call that function to obtain the value and then render it. This is what markup considers a dynamic value, and we will also learn about this in a dedicated later video. By the way, this ability to handle functions directly in the template is what makes templating with markup super powerful, allowing you to create functions that encapsulate a logic and then be used in the template to render the result. Another thing markup templates handle well is DOM elements. For example, I can create a button element and then inject it. And it will render it just fine. This is something probably unique to markup and one that closes the gap between real DOM and markup templating, making them work seamlessly, which is something you would probably want. If you already have some code or library that outputs real DOM elements, you can just use it with markup and everything will be just fine. Markup was created to extend the DOM and not to replace it, which is why it is easy to work with it. Another object that is specially handled is HTML template instance itself. This means that I can create a template and then inject it in another for composition. What makes this more powerful is that markup tracks data rather than DOM element. If I inject a template, that template exists separately, and changes in that template will not affect or influence the template around it. And that's one of the details that makes markup template rendering super efficient. You probably wondered, what if I have an HTML string like this button, for example, and wanted to render it as is? Like I said, markup will render anything as string, so this will just be a string. However, if I wanted markup to parse a string, which is a dangerous thing to do, it would be best if I use the HTML tag as function instead. So what you will need to do is call HTML and provide an array of strings to parse. And I'll provide this button a string here and we'll parse it. If you are to do this, please make sure the string is not coming from user inputs or from some source you don't have full control or know how these strings are being put together. Otherwise, you will open your app for HTML injection attacks. Another thing Markup handles really well is native web components. For example, if I have a to-do item web component that accepts a to-do as input, I can have a to-do object and render this tag passing my to-do object. Markup understands that this is a web component tag and that I have this data object that I want to pass to it. If I query this tag in the DOM, oops, I need to give it a different name, and check the browser, we can see that Markup JSON stringified it and encoded a string. Like I said, everything is rendered a string. However, if I log the element to do property, we can see here on line 5 that this object is our to-do object we wanted to pass. The way it works is that Markup will check if this to-do attribute is an observed attribute and check if a matching property exists. And as long as it is writable, it sets that value there. Markup is not serializing or deserializing any data. If I compare this property value with our to-do object, you will see that they are exactly the same. Also, this is not something special to object literals. Any data you want to pass to your web component will be passed as is. For example, I change this to-do to a map, and we can see that it is passed just fine. As the attribute value, it is a simple curly braces string. This is because that's how map string writes to. But the real value is passed to the component correctly, as you can see in the logs here. By the way, this is not something that happens in native web component. Native web component only accepts attributes with primitive values, and developers often need to serialize data before passing down. But with Markup, it is handled just fine. There are additional things that it is handled in a special way in the templates. These are states and helpers, but we will learn more about them in a dedicated video later. For now, know these special handlers and play around to have a feel of how the template handles different injected values.